Good morning and welcome to CABE webinar for Wednesday, 24th of August. And today we are looking at designer competence, providing an overview of the duty holding regime in England and Wales, followed by a detailed explanation of the duties that will be imposed on designers. My name is Rosemary and I'm the Regional Services Coordinator here at CABE, and I'll be acting as moderator for this morning's session. We like to make our webinars interactive, so we do encourage you throughout the session to send in any questions as we go along, which we will address with a Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you're watching us live, you can use the side panel to send your questions in. The speaker will hold a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. Alternatively, you can get in touch with us via the social links that are now showing on your screen. Let me introduce you to today's webinar speaker, Richard Harral, Technical Director for CABE. He has previously worked as an architect in both public and private sector practice and as a policy official in the Building Regulations divisions of MHCLG between 2007 and 2014, where he oversaw introduction of policies on accessible housing, security standards, broadband, and the National Space Standard for new homes. He was subsequently head of technical policy in the period. He currently sits on the CIC Competence Steering Group and chairs a number of competency working groups, including design and architect competence. He was technical director author for Flex 8670, the recently published British Standard on Competence for Building Safety in Built Environment Industries. So I'm now going to ask Richard to take over and start his presentation. We'd just like to wait a couple of minutes while he gets himself ready, and then we will begin. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can see the presentation introduction slide there. Great to be speaking to you all this morning about designer competence. This is going to be the first in a series of webinars or sessions that we're going to start running, looking at detail of the regulatory reform agenda in England in particular, but also about what's going on in other parts of the UK. Today, I'm going to try and give you an understanding of why designer competence is something you should be thinking about. In the process of preparing this presentation, it's become very clear to me that that also means you need to understand quite a bit about the other duty holding responsibilities that are being imposed through the Building Safety Act. So I'm going to talk about how all of these duties interrelate. I'm going to start by looking at legislation, liability and sanctions, the kind of grim stuff, if you like, but the reasons, the kind of key drivers why, as a very minimum in terms of regulatory competence, you need to be up to speed on duty holding responsibilities and understand if you are a designer. An overview of the duty holding roles, talk about who is a designer, talk about the general duties of the designer, specific duties of the designer, and then talk a bit about how compliance can be achieved. I should say that there's going to be more detail that needs to sit behind all of this. I think if you're working primarily as a designer, then at some stage in the next 12 to 18 months, you probably want to look for some formal training on these liabilities and process and look out for further guidance as to how the designer competencies can be met, because that's going to be an area that develops. These duties are primarily coming into force, as I understand it, although the transitional arrangements are not 100% clear, October 2023. And there are separate requirements for designer competence for higher risk buildings. Those will come in two stages. Primarily for Gateway 2, which is the building control application stage for higher risk buildings in October 2023, and Gateway 3, which is the occupation stage from October 2024. It's really worth stressing that these duties are applicable to all building work. So if you are speaking to people and they say, oh no, this is only to do with high risk buildings, that's just not the case. So it's really important to get a grip with that. So we're going to look at legislation and liability and sanctions first. One caveat, further caveat, the consultation that government has currently published on the implementation of these requirements does not have alongside it the actual draft regulations, the statutory instrument that sets out the very specific details of how this regime is going to be implemented. So we will update once that becomes available, but this is based primarily on prior understanding, previously published documents, and the current consultation. But we think there's some further detail that will need to be brought to the surface and understood over time. So legislation-wise, it's always good to understand the root of where certain requirements sit if you ever need to refer back to them. So what we're going to look at today are the kind of drivers that the Building Safety Regulator has under Part 2 of the Building Safety Act. In particular, their functions for oversight of competence and registration of building control professionals, but primarily focusing on their interest in competence, which is a key element of the duty holding regime. And then the bulk of what we're going to look at is in Part 3 of the Building Safety Act, which refers to amendments to the Building Act 1984, which is the basis for these requirements applying to all types of building work, although there are different requirements for higher risk buildings. Part 3 looks at duty holders and general duties and industry competence, and enforcement, including liabilities of officers of body corporate, which I'll talk about in a moment. There are links across to Part 4 of the Building Safety Act, high risk buildings, particularly building safety managers and accountable persons. Of course, the building safety manager role has disappeared, but also in both cases, in Part 3 and Part 4, enforcement. These are kind of cross-linked to Schedules 1, 2, and 3 of the Act, if you need to refer to them, which cover amendments to the Health and Safety at Work Act, investigatory powers, and cooperation and information sharing requirements. So within the Act, Part 2 of the Act sets out the regulator and its functions, and it has a range of key duties and functions that it needs to comply with. The legal application of the Act is that it's primarily applied in England, but comparative measures will be applied in Wales. There are going to be differences with the way matters operate in Wales, but the simplest way to describe this, as I understand it at the moment, is that Wales will implement most of these measures, but it will not appoint a separate building safety regulator to undertake these functions. As I said, the powers that the Building Safety Regulator have are delivered through amendments to Schedule 1 of the Health and Safety at Work Act, which extend powers to cover building safety, not health and safety at work, and enable prosecution in relation to building safety matters. Then there's a series of duties that are set out. There are 5 key duties: duty to facilitate safety in high buildings, duty to keep safety and standard of buildings in review, and then the one we're most interested in, facilitating improvement in competence of industry and building inspectors, proposals and consultation on regulations, and duty to establish system for giving of building safety information. As part of that competence work, which is directly linked to the duty holding frameworks, the Building Safety Regulator will establish a committee on industry competence that we call the Industry Competence Committee, which is charged with monitoring industry competence, advising the regulator, advising persons in the built environment, facilitating persons in the built environment to improve their competence, providing guidance to the public on how to assess competence, and undertaking research and analysis. And the reason this is important is because the competence elements of the duty holding regime are going to be scrutinized on a continual basis, and they're going to be scrutinized in 2 different ways. One, through this Industry Competence Committee, and in the second part, through investigations and the actual work of the Building Safety Regulator on a regular basis. So whilst the competence standards might seem the softer part of this duty holding framework, they're really critical and very, very prominent in the primary legislation. The Building Act amendments that are in the Building Safety Act, it's Clause 34 and Clause 39. So Clause 34 effectively gives the government powers to require people of a specific description to be appointed in prescribed circumstances. So in this case, the most obvious example of the principal designer and principal contractor that clients will have to appoint. But it's also about setting express conditions for duties that are imposed on specific people who are described in the legislation. Again, accountable persons, clients, principal designers, principal contractors, designers and contractors. It sets requirements for what are known as general duties. And these are kind of very broad-based requirements that apply to everybody. And they're focused around coordination, communication, collaboration, compliance with the building regulations, managing the competence of people and the limits of competence of both individuals and organizations. And we'll come on to that later. Clause 39 looks at industry competence more widely, and it's not directly relevant, but it emphasizes the importance that the regulator is going to place on competence. In terms of enforcement, as I said, the building safety regulator is going to act as the building control body on high risk buildings and will directly apply all of the duty holding requirements and expect them to be just demonstrated in a very, very clear way on these high risk buildings. There is an expectation that all building control bodies will be looking at how duty holding obligations, which are part of the building regulations from this point forward, remember, and they're not a set of separate requirements through other legislation. These are fundamental requirements within the building regulations now and within the Building Act. Those are expected to be enforced, and we wait to see how the building safety regulator drives that enforcement activity within local authorities and within what will be building control approvers. But it's not something that is going to be purely retrospective in its application. That said, it is very much, because this is all based as a mirror on the way that the CDM regulations work, it is fair to say that the duty holding framework is very much a framework which facilitates prosecution and enforcement retrospectively rather than proactively. The proactive bit is what industry is supposed to do. The framework allows the regulators to take action in a very broad-based manner when something goes wrong. So what I wanted to do here was just highlight some of the new sanctions offences. These aren't all of the new sanctions and offences that have been introduced, but they're probably the most relevant and have the most direct impact on day-to-day work and liability. So there are new sanctions for compliance notices and stop notices, which are both capable of leading to criminal prosecution if not complied with. I think that's 1 or 2 years in prison and unlimited fines for those. There's a new offence of liability of officers of body corporate. So if an organisation is found guilty of a breach of the building regulations and is prosecuted successfully, then all of the people really, I mean, it says here any director, manager, secretary or other officer, but it's pretty much anyone who works for that organisation can also be individually prosecuted if they consented, connived or were neglectful contributing to that offence. And there's also an offence of failing to provide information to the building safety regulator, which again, if you don't comply with that, there's an unlimited fine or 1 or 2 years in prison as a possible consequence. So if you're asked by the building safety regulator to provide information on how you're exercising your duty holding responsibilities or managing your competence, you need to have that information ready. You need to be able to do that. And if you can't or won't, then the consequences can be quite severe. It's also critical to understand that there are some really significant strengthening of powers as well within the Act. So the breach of building regulations under Section 35 and notice requiring rectification under Section 36 both have their time periods for enforcement extended from 1 or 2 years to 10 years. That really does extend the envelope during which defects within a building may be identified as breaching the requirements of the building regulations or other aspects of the law, and it opens up a much wider window for enforcement action or prosecution. And we really need to be thinking about, as building professionals and building engineers, really need to be thinking about how that changes the advice we give to clients and the standards that we set. Again, unlimited fine on conviction, up to £200 per day until default corrected. And then the extension of the Defective Premises Act, which is from April the 28th this year, 30 years retrospectively, and then for all work going forward from April 28th this year, 15 years prospectively. So that's, again, I think that's extended from 6 years. So it's an enormous extension of the liability period. Any of these events, any event which results in an investigation can result in professionals or the parties involved in a building project being required to demonstrate how they were competent to do that project and how they discharged their duty holding responsibilities. So again, what I'm trying to do is emphasize that these are not simple, nice to have, we'll think about it when it becomes a problem, issues in terms of meeting your duty holding requirements across all building work. I'm going to emphasize that again, this applies to all building work with additional requirements for higher risk buildings. It's something that you need to be thinking proactively about managing and putting measures in place to deal with. Let's talk about the duty holding roles. I've already described that the model for the new duty holding regime is the CDM 2015 duty holding regime that we should all be familiar with a couple of notable differences. The first is the presence of the accountable person in this framework. The accountable person is the person defined in the Building Safety Act as being responsible for maintaining the safety of the building. That they are, as the name suggests, the person who's going to be called to account. There's a thing called the principal accountable person, which is a person designated, an individual designated to have responsibility for that building. But this is a non-delegatable responsibility. And then you have the kind of more traditional CDM framework, which is the client, principal designer, principal contractor, designer, and contractor. And the reason I've shaped this diagram this way is because the accountable person and client may be the same body. They're quite often linked, but the client is the person commissioning work. So we have to recognize these two distinct legal entities. The accountable person or principal accountable person is in law the person responsible for maintaining the safety of a building, and the client is the person who is commissioning the work on the building in kind of broadest terms. Within the framework, there's also a kind of link bank between designers and contractors in particular, which is a way of kind of closing the loops. The client needs to ensure that the principal designer and principal contractor at their point are competent, and there's a record keeping and process and a requirement to kind of put down in writing how they've gone about assuring that in some detail. So they check that the principal designer and principal contractor are competent. Designers and contractors have to ensure that the client understands their duties to do that and their other duties before they start work. So there's a kind of circular checking process where everyone is kind of driving each other to make sure that duty holding requirements are understood and met. As I said, the accountable person is the building owner or the person responsible for safety. Client is the person commissioning the work. The principal designer coordinates the design work and design phase, but still has an ongoing role throughout the rest of the project. The designers are typically the people who undertake design work. And then in the other branch, we have the principal contractor who supervises construction, and contractors who are basically those parties who undertake construction work. Now, we are gradually pulling together, with a lot of work between government and industry, a set of standards that set out how these expectations can be more clearly met. So underneath each of those brief descriptions, I've written the name of the relevant standard that you might want to reference. So, For principal designers, there's a public available specification, PAS 8671, which is the Principal Designer Competence Framework. For principal contractors, it's PAS 8672. Those are both British standard publicly available specifications that have been developed under the aegis of the Department for Levelling Up Homes and Communities. So they're government sponsored standards. To support those, industry working groups have developed designer competence frameworks and contractor competence frameworks to start to put the detail in place as to what those expectations might need to be. So there's a working group 7 framework that's coming out for consultation on designers, and the working group 9 framework, which is out on contracts, and I'll talk about those more a bit later. So let's talk about how the appointments process works, because appointments are pretty critical to this duty holding model. So the expectation is that clients will appoint both a principal designer and a principal contractor. There are some simplified arrangements for domestic clients that I'll talk about in a moment. Very similar to the CDM 2015 arrangements, but basically introduces requirements to comply with building regulations in lieu of health and safety practice. That means there's different competence, and this is recognized by the government. They say, you know, if you're a principal designer or a principal contractor or a designer or contractor in terms of the CDM regulations, you've got a set of duties in relation to health and safety, but those are different competence requirements to the those needed to comply with those duty holding requirements under the Building Act. Now, this is potentially quite confusing. This has been raised repeatedly through the process of policy development since the Hackett Review was published, that having 2 sets of duty holders with the same names and within mirrored frameworks could lead to confusion, given that they need different competence and actually have quite different requirements for compliance when you look at it in detail. But this is the route that the government has decided to go down, and it's one we need to understand. So in any case, whether it's principal designers, principal contractors, designers, contractors, these could all be the same persons under CDM 2015 and under the requirements to meet with the Building Act. So for both health and safety at work and for building regulations compliance purposes, they could be the same person. But they could also be 2 different people, and they could also be individuals, or they could be organizations. So as with CDM, this is left quite broad in terms of the actual way that these duties are fulfilled. But it is very clear that if the same person does both roles, they will need to have a much greater in-depth capacity, particularly as a principal designer and designer, to undertake design work and understand compliance with building regulations and technical issues that are quite often outside the remit of CDM 2050. Sorry, excuse me, CDF 2015. In terms of appointments for domestic projects, and a domestic client is someone for whom a project is carried out which is not done in connection with business, the contractor automatically acts as both the principal designer and principal contractor if they're the only person doing work. And duties fall on principal designers and principal contractors where there's more than one contractor. Again, where you are involved in a domestic project, if there's more than one party involved, then you need to agree with them who is taking on the principal designer responsibilities. You need to do that in writing with and through agreement with both the client and the principal contractor. If there is only one designer involved, then by default there'll be the principal designer, and the duties imposed on those roles include planning, managing and monitoring the project, taking reasonable steps to ensure competence, and taking reasonable steps to ensure the PD, principal designer and principal contractor, have relevant competence to fulfill the duties. So There's a mixture there of a slightly lighter touch set of requirements for domestic clients to take some steps to ensure that their principal designers and contractors have relevant competence. But you do need to sort out, if you're involved in domestic level projects, you need to be very clear about who is responsible, and then you need to act accordingly. So that brings us on to the key question: who is a designer? This is actually a much bigger question than might be thought. The regulations are probably going to use a definition very similar to this, which is that a designer means any person, including a client, contractor, or other person referred to in these regulations, who in the course of a business, A, carries out any design work, or B, arranges for or instructs any person under their control to do so. That could cover a huge range of people: acoustic consultants, landscape consultants, lighting designers, but critically as well, product manufacturers, system designers, specialist subcontractors. Anyone who basically prepares or modifies a design or supervises someone doing that role is likely to be caught. So if in doubt, assume you're a designer. What does design cover? Drawings, design details, specifications, bills of quantity, design calculations, physical models, BIM models, virtual models, visualization, schedules of work. We think this is the likely kind of scope. And any respecification or despecification of any of those elements, or the redesign or modification of any of those elements. So as you can see, it's going to capture a huge swathe of the building industry. And people have got to be very, very careful not to assume these responsibilities accidentally. If in doubt, do not assume that someone else is the designer. So whatever role you have, make sure that you are very clear as to where design responsibilities are through discussion with the client or the principal designer. Confirm those in writing: who's the principal designer, who the other designers on the project are, and where the scope of responsibilities lie. And if you're still unclear, probably best to assume you are a designer and act accordingly. What does that mean in practice? Well, general duties imposed on everyone are to plan, manage, and monitor their work to ensure the building work complies with the building regulations. Sounds like a pretty simple requirement, but you're going to need to look at all of your policies and procedures to make sure you record that so you can demonstrate it if you're challenged or you're finding yourself on the wrong end of a compliance issue with the regulators. They have to cooperate with other duty holders. So this is about positive behaviors, sharing information, effective communication, supporting each other to achieve compliance, meeting gateway and golden thread requirements and mandatory occurrence reporting requirements for high risk buildings. But the duty to cooperate is for all types of building work. And then ensure they and the people they appoint are competent, which is based in skills, knowledge and experience and behaviors, appropriate organizational capability, focused in this case on ensuring that design work and building work they're engaged to do, they have the competence to do that and they work within the limits of that competence. Again, need to record how you've gone through that process. It will become quite standardized, I'm sure, the way that that's done, but you need to record it case by case, context by context on each project. And these are duties applicable to everybody. If we're looking more at the specific duties, and we're going to talk about duties on the client first, there are interlinking responsibilities here. So the reason that designers need to understand client responsibilities is because they have to ensure that the client understand that their duties prior to commencing work. So you need to ask the client or explain to the client what their duties are and make sure that you've got it in writing that they agree they understand what they are. In general, those responsibilities will be making suitable arrangements for planning, managing and monitoring the project. Okay, so there needs to be a kind of process whereby those decisions are recorded, and including the allocation of sufficient time and resource. This is a really, really big issue, I think, that has not been picked up on particularly, but for clients, they're going to have a really solid argument as to how they've identified the timescale for doing the work and whether there's enough resource, including money, to deliver it in compliance with the building regulations. They have to make sure they appoint a principal designer and a principal contractor in appropriate circumstances, and they need to provide information to every designer and contractor to enable them to comply with the building regulations, and to make them aware if that project includes any work on a higher risk building. That they also need to cooperate and share information with other relevant duty holders. For the designer, there's a requirement that they don't start work unless they're satisfied that the client is aware of their duties. When carrying out design work, they have to ensure that if built, the building work to which the design relates would be in compliance with all relevant requirements. So this is worded in a very specific way so that designers, if you keep track of the information you provide and you're confident that if the project is built in that way, it will be compliant, then you will have discharged that duty. This is a way of managing the kind of interface of responsibility between principal contractors and principal designers, contractors and designers. It's kind of a manageable way of allocating responsibility. There's a requirement to provide all sufficient information about the design, construction and maintenance of the building to assist others, including other designers and contractors, to comply with the relevant requirements. If you're only undertaking part of the design of the building work, you have to consider other design work which directly relates to that building work and report any concerns as to compliance to the principal designer. So this is about managing interfaces of responsibility and driving towards a much more holistic approach to establishing performance and outcomes from the design as a whole. Again, it means that you need to look at the processes you have as a designer, risk assess where the interfaces you have are critical to performance, and then put in place measures to kind of check and flag any concerns you might have about the work that's being done by others. And there also needs to, there's a responsibility to advise the principal designer if they think at any time the design work relates to work on a higher risk building. Principal designer should be a designer. This is set out in the regulations and in guidance that's being produced. But in practice, they could be any of the people who currently undertake principal designer duties under CDM. Whether those people genuinely have the competence to meet the following duties is it's certainly in terms of understanding that design work and coordinating design work to comply with building regulations. I think that's an open question. But very briefly, the principal designer plan, manages and monitors the design work, coordinates the design work to ensure it complies, ensures that all designers and others working on the project cooperate, and liaise with the principal contractor and assist the client in providing information to others. Specific duties on contractors, well, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but there is a requirement on contractors to not undertake any work they believe is not in compliance with building regulations. So if you're acting as a designer, you need to be aware that you may get pushback on that basis if a contractor is not happy with what is going on. The principal contractor's role, very analogous to the principal designer, but during the construction phase. So key elements of compliance that you need to consider here. You need to ensure clients are aware of their duties, that responsibility to act as a principal designer are discussed and assigned and agreed and in writing. Recording things is very important in this process going forward. You need to make sure you're working within the limits of your own competence and that everyone you're supervising or appointing or recommending to appoint works within the limits of their competence. And then you need to exercise suitable oversight of those who are under supervision, collaborate and share information with clients and other project team members, including flagging designs about design work, have procedures in place to plan, manage, monitor, record and review work, and ensure that work complies with the relevant requirements of the building regulations. So this last point, of course, sorry that the numbering is wrong there, but compliance with the building regulations is the primary driver behind this duty holding regime. It is the main focus. Everything else is aimed at facilitating that compliance. For high risk buildings, there are a series of additional procedures and requirements applicable to designers. The clients have to ensure designers and contractors are aware they're working on an HRB. I would suggest that anyone working as a designer or anything that looks vaguely like an HRB, when they are writing to the client to make sure they understand their duties, should ask the question, is this a higher risk building? The client and other duty holders have to retain records of the steps taken to check competence. On high risk buildings, that'll be part of what's known as a competence declaration that the client or someone on the client's behalf has to sign, saying these people and the supply chain that we've appointed are competent. But as with other aspects of the higher risk regime, some of the fact that, retaining records of how you've checked the competence of people that you're going to be held responsible for is a really important thing to do. So it really should span outside high risk buildings as well. The appointment of the principal designer and principal contractor must be made prior to the building control application being submitted. The principal designer and the principal contractor also have to undertake competence checks, including identifying any historic offences or serious infractions within 5 years prior to appointment. So this is a very specific set of requirements that have been introduced quite late on, but essentially they're saying, on a higher risk building, principal designers and principal contractors had to identify anyone within their supply chain responsibilities who's been subject to a compliance notice in relation to Part A structure or Part B fire safety contraventions. Anyone who's been subject to a stop notice for a contravention of any requirement of the building regulations. Any person who's been convicted for an offence under the Building Safety Act, Building Act or Regulatory Reform Fire Order. Any conviction for offence under Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, or any finding by a formal inquiry of behaviour that directly resulted in loss of life, misleading of customers, or failure to meet regulatory requirements. Now, you can still appoint someone who's had one of these infractions, but you have to justify why you think that appointment is still acceptable and sensible. I will be making these slides available, so I'm just looking at the questions in the bar. These questions will be available to everyone afterwards. Sorry, I should have said that earlier. You can stop scribbling notes now. But critically, in relation to these infractions, there needs to be a recorded set of declarations by your supply chain that they are not subject to any of these. And you need to hold on to that for a long time. If you're thinking about the limitations of responsibility, we've got 10 years for enforcement or compliance notices, and we've got 15 years for the Defective Premises Act. So you're going to need to retain these records for a lot longer than has been traditionally the case. There are also a series of duty holder declarations for higher risk buildings where competence and discharge of duty holding responsibilities will be a material fact or factor. For clients, those are the declarations, a gateway 2, which is a statement of competence for the principal designer and principal contractor. This is the building control application stage, including records of checks undertaken. And at gateway 3 occupation, the client has to sign a statement or a statement signed on behalf of the client that confirms to the best of the client's knowledge that the higher risk building as built complies with all applicable requirements of the building regulations. The client will not be able to delegate that responsibility to an external organisation as such as the principal designer or principal contractor. They have to take that responsibility themselves. There's a principal designer declaration. These are not written into the duty holding requirements. These, by the way, these are written into the gateway stage requirements. But the principal designer, and it says in the regs quite specifically each principal designer, so it assumes almost that there'll be more than one principal designer, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So each principal designer involved in the project at any stage with their contact details, dates of appointment, and a statement confirming that they took all reasonable steps to fulfill their duties as a principal designer under the proposal set out in the previous section. Now, and then the contractor has to sign a similar declaration. Now, this is changed in significant ways from earlier drafts where the principal designer and principal contractor were going to be required to sign statements that the building complied with the building regulations. That was seen as something that neither could do to a sufficient degree of certainty, given the complexity of the interrelationship between construction and design, and it was probably and quite regarded quite as a quite seriously uninsurable risk ultimately. So this has now changed, and although a statement that says you've taken all reasonable steps to fulfill duties as a principal designer includes a duty to coordinate matters and seek to ensure that the work complies with building regulations, it's a more reasonable level of surety, which is reasonably insurable. Okay, so how do we go about actually demonstrating compliance? Good practice on this is going to evolve over time. I'm sure we will be producing some good practice notes to help people, but those will by necessity have to follow once the actual regulations are put in place. We don't want to issue guidance for people that isn't accurate, but there are certain things that we can all think about and do. The four elements we think need to be looked at are behavioural, about acting responsibly. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Procedural, so reviewing the processes you have, inserting the right quality management, quality control measures into your procedural framework so that you do not misstep. Again, that's going to take a kind of line by line analysis of the regs and other aspects of guidance, in addition to stepping back and sense checking the rightness, the correctness, the appropriateness of the way that you work, to ensure that you can demonstrate compliance with the key stages of the duty holding cycle. Managerial systems need to be looked at, which is about exercising effective oversight and control, not just over process, but of competence in particular. So applying good standards of competence management, getting your record keeping sorted, investing in your staff, training, etc., etc. Those things need to be looked at. And technical, probably the biggest part of this is actually about, again, stepping back and looking at how designers approach compliance with building regulations. Do you need to think about going a bit further than the minimum standards that are set? Do you want to add or advise clients to add extra layers of resilience or safety or performance into the work that they do? Because bear in mind, these requirements, I'll show you the legal requirements for compliance in a moment, but they're all of the building regulations, not just fire and safety, or fire and structure, sorry, although fire and structure do take are predominant in the kind of outcomes that are intended. So again, behaviours: act ethically, contribute to safe outcomes, demonstrate personal and collective responsibility, and manage competence. Manage your own competence, both individually and organisationally. In terms of process, that means understanding the duty holding framework, understanding client duties and procedures, understand the duties of how they differ for domestic clients, understand requirements before commencing work. What do you need to have in place before you start work? Understand the general duties and understand the specific duties. Exercise oversight and control, so that's project planning and project management practice. Effectively manage information. Again, think about how you can extend the golden thread principles and processes into the rest of your work, which is covered by duty holding responsibilities. Look really clearly about how you and your staff communicate, cooperate, and collaborate, and exercise effective design risk management. In terms of technical compliance, really make sure that you understand relevant requirements and how they relate to your work and how they relate to the interfaces of your work with others. You've got to look really closely at the technical competence needed to execute work and justify it, not just to tick boxes, but to understand why you've done things and to be able to explain those. Make sure that you fully understand the procedural requirements of the building regulations. They've got more complicated, certainly in terms of higher risk buildings, but in general, there is a greater degree of complexity now in compliance. And make sure you've got the technical skills to comply with the technical requirements. In terms of competence, the guidance that's been issued is that people need to have the right skills, knowledge and experience and behaviors. That's individuals, and then organizations should have the organizational capability to design in a way which complies with the building regulations. Individual competence is now being described in more detail in the competence frameworks that are coming out from industry working groups. And as I spoke about earlier, there's one on designer competence that's out for consultation at the moment. There's another on contractor or site supervisor competence, plus the principal designer and principal contractor frameworks. There's no framework for clients at the moment, but it seems sensible to me that someone does produce that at some stage, because competent clients would be a good thing. So detail on all of this is being produced. It's recognized within this framework that people will be in training or being supervised, and that's okay as they build up their knowledge and understanding to become competent, providing that they are actually formally in a process of training and are appropriately supervised. There's a requirement in the regulations that if at any stage a designer becomes aware that they are no longer competent to undertake work, maybe that's because skills have atrophied, or maybe it's because a project trips over into being a higher risk building where they don't feel they have the necessary competence when previously it wasn't, so it gets a bit taller or it changes its use, or there are various ways that could happen. They have to tell the principal designer, and they have to inform the person who asked them to undertake the design work that they don't think they can do it anymore. But demonstrating also competence also means basically making sure that you're following industry good practice. So this isn't just about the minimum requirements of the regulations, and we're seeing this in court cases coming through already in terms of defective premises and in terms of remediation. The courts will look not just at the minimum standards in regulation, but they will look at other industry standard guidance, other best practice or good practice documentation that's available in relation to any specific issue, and they will ask questions as to why that wasn't taken into account alongside the minimum standards in regulation. Membership of an established trade or professional body is seen as a baseline minimum for competence. Having relevant experience of the type of work that people are undertaking. This is all part of good competence management processes, to self-assess and to look at the work that you really are competent to do and ask whether things that you're doing are out of scope. And this is, really common for designers to get stretched into spaces where perhaps they need to be careful, but also to look at how the frameworks that you use to justify or demonstrate compliance have as oversight by third-party organisations, in particular competence assessment processes. And this is about credibility to ensure that there's no optimism bias and that standards are rigorous and robust. I mentioned earlier that I define what the relevant requirements are. So the duty holding regs make lots of references to relevant requirements, compliance with relevant requirements of the building regulations. Well, here they are. So there's a series of individual regulations which cover various aspects of construction. So defining what's covered, materials and workmanship limitations, a lot of the energy performance requirements that are not in Schedule 1, water efficiency, sound insulation testing, and mechanical ventilation airflow testing. Regulations 4 to 42, various in there. And then Schedule 1 of the building regulations, Part A to Part S, which hopefully you'll all be familiar with. As you go through the process of making sure that you understand all of these things, there are other bits of legislation that you're going to need to be aware of. So CDM Regulations 2015, the Building Act 1984 is amended, the Building Regulations 2010 is amended, Building Safety Act 2022, Currently, there are draft regulations that have been withdrawn, but they'll become the building appointment of persons, industry competence and duty holders regulations, the definition of higher risk buildings regulations, and the higher risk buildings descriptions and supplementary provisions. It's probably also worth adding the regulatory reform fire safety order into that list, because they are becoming increasingly interlinked. If you want to find out more, the government consultation on Part 3 of the Building Safety Act is currently live at the address above, and these slides will get issued shortly. The consultation on the designer competence framework is available online. The site supervisor and contractor competence framework consultation is also available online, and the existing standards now published for principal designers and principal contractors, and other information on built environments competence standards from BSI, so PAS 8671 and PAS 8672, are also available online. If you need to find more information, I recommend that you look there. Where should you focus your attention? Already talked about this, and we're getting a little bit short on time, but competence, you need good competence management practice, which records how you've managed on an ongoing basis the competence of both your organization and the individuals within it. So professional accreditation and membership, but also good annual review, reflection, self-assessment, constant rechecking of limits of competence when you take on new work, and also looking seriously about formal accreditation against organizational competence standards such as ISO 9001, but BSI have also recently published 99001, which is a specific quality management standard for the construction industry. Reviewing process and records, so getting procedures into alignment, making sure that you check all of the relevant appointments and key stages are met, and then reviewing your record management and review processes to take into account new timescales. Communication and collaboration requires mainstreaming of effective behaviours. Look at how your organisation communicates and shares information. You need to be totally transparent. If something goes wrong and you end up on the wrong side of a prosecution and you've withheld safety critical information or information that was necessary that you share with other members of the design team to deliver compliance with the building regulations, then you may be found wanting. And open up to get some more feedback. We do not spend anywhere near enough time asking for feedback from the people we work with, and dealing with that by acting to put in place better measurement, management, communication procedures, and then focus, a really profound focus on procedural and technical compliance with the building regulations, including, and this is my general advice going forward, seriously think about what additional levels of protection you can add above the minimum in terms of advising clients as to how they can demonstrate that they've not just met the minimum standards but exceeded them, and to also avoid things going wrong, to have that added level of protection for the people who will live and work in and around buildings. Okay, so I hope that's been useful. There will be, I'm sure, a lot more detail coming out in the new year, I would imagine. So as I said, the timescales for this are October 2023, but it's worth starting to look at how you need to change your processes in the interim. I've got one question up from people watching, from me and Spencer. It says, with domestic work where the designer completes the design and prepares and gains plan check for building regulations only with no site supervision, how would this affect the designer? Okay, so what seems to be coming out in terms of case law, and this is a really profound point, is that designers find it very difficult to escape the implications of construction phase decisions and events, even if they're no longer involved. This is something that's probably worth us looking at in more detail over time. But even where in design and build contracts, designers' appointments have been terminated and the contractors have made decisions about specification or taken work through to more advanced stages, and there have been problems with compliance. We've seen this in the work on fire safety remediation in particular. The designers are not seen as being able to step away from those responsibilities. Domestic work, there's an issue of proportionality, and the BSR has been very clear that it will look at all enforcement action or compliance action through a lens of proportionality in the way that the HSE has always done in terms of workplace site safety. So I think that you need to look at, as a designer, you need to look at the information that's provided and make sure you're confident it really is adequate, so that if it was executed in that way, then you'd be confident of compliance. That might mean you need to provide a bit more information than you have done, or you might need to give very specific directions about what can't be changed. So, if you think about it in terms of critical dimensions, you might actually say, the specification of these items are critical to safety or to other elements, to emphasize that they should not be changed if you're not going to be involved. And you need to make sure that the limits of your responsibility are clearly set out in writing. So it's not by any means watertight. The courts will look at the regulatory framework primarily, rather than allowing contractual clauses which divest risk to take precedence. But if you make clear at the point that information is handed back to a client or handed over to the contractor, if you're not going to be involved, the extent to which they are your responsibilities are limited, then I think, and maybe also being very, very clear that any contractor who changes what you've designed, anyone who changes the requirements that you've set out may be taking on the designer responsibility. So we will learn more over time. Sorry, Ian, I can't be absolutely clear on this, but I think that the likelihood is that, just trying to be clear, making sure that other people understand when they take on those responsibilities, certainly at a domestic level, might be as good as we can get. Plus, like I say, reviewing what information you think is, reviewing the information you provide to make sure you're confident there's enough there to comply. So I hope that's useful. Second questions come in. Please summarize the requirements of a building inspector relative to the duty holder regulations. So I might almost ask David to answer this question, because I think he's probably involved more closely with the thinking of the building safety regulator than I am. But the building inspectors are going to have to look at how duty holding responsibilities are being discharged as part of their work. So as we know, a building inspector should never advise on design. That hasn't changed. So they should never be assuming the responsibilities of designer within this framework. Any building inspectors who are finding themselves in a position where they are advising on design, I think need to think about that very, very carefully indeed. But my understanding is that the building inspector's primary role will be to make sure that there's reasonable evidence. There's reasonable evidence that the people acting meet these duty holding requirements. So, we do not know what the guidance from the BSR will say. Will it say that you should ask for evidence of the competence of the design team and the contracting team and the subcontracting teams on all building work? Certainly that's going to be the case for higher risk buildings. Will there be requirements for statements setting out how duty holding requirements are being discharged? Will the building inspectors need to see letters going between the various parties confirming that they understand their duty holding responsibilities? We don't know. but it would be great to get greater clarity. And I think, once these consultations are over, most of them end in October. So in the new year, I think you will start to see the specific detail of these expectations coming forward, which we would welcome. But as I say, building inspectors should not find themselves operating within this framework, but they will find themselves overseeing it. Finally, last question for today from Mike Hill. Please clarify, we are not able to submit a building control application before a principal contractor is appointed. So for higher risk buildings, what has been made specific in the consultation is that for higher risk buildings, I don't think this is true for all buildings, but for higher risk buildings, the principal designer and principal contractor have to be appointed before the building control application is submitted. Now, excuse me, that is a potentially huge issue in terms of current custom and practice. It is a massive change for the industry to take on board. What the BSR have said is that they expect extensive prior engagement before a building control application is submitted on a higher risk building. So there's a kind of expectation that there'll be discussions and exchanges of information that enable people to be confident that they are, heading towards a satisfactory application, one that the BSR is going to deem compliant and allow them through the gateway stage. But of course, at the moment, it's normal or more normal for people to get the building control approval, move into a procurement phase and appoint the contractor after that level of surety has been obtained. But it is absolutely clear that the expectation is that both the principal designer and principal contractor will be appointed before a building control application is submitted. So what does that point at? Well, looking at it from an optimistic point of view, we are big fans at CABE of collaborative contracting processes. So contractual frameworks that have earlier construction side engagement, that have collaboration frameworks that bring project teams together at an earlier stage. Those certainly seem to be the kind of mechanisms that will be necessary. But it does mean that the whole process changes, and it has big implications for procurement, and it shifts where risk lies with clients, doesn't it? Because they're going to have to bring a principal contractor in at an earlier stage of the work than they normally would do and be tied to that principal contractor. Now, one thing I would note, and I didn't pick up on this properly, but the whole system does allow the principal designer and principal contractor to change as in terms of who they are through the course of the project. And there are a whole series of mechanisms that will be in place to manage that process that are going to be detailed in the regulations. I think it's not particularly good practice to chop and change between the principal designer and principal contractor roles. And incidentally, the principal contractor can be both the principal designer and the principal contractor, if they are competent can demonstrate they're competent to do that. But the simple answer is yes. For a higher risk building, certainly the principal contractor is going to have to be appointed before the building control application is submitted. I hope that's been useful. Thanks very much, Tim. I'll bring that to an end because I realise that time is moving on. We will be looking at producing a series of additional events or webinars to talk through other aspects of the Building Safety Act. Please do go to the designer and site supervisor contractor consultations and provide your input. Have a look through those frameworks, which are useful in explaining in more explicit detail what's going to be expected. And I look forward to presenting to you all again in the very near future. And I'll now just stop sharing my screen and hand back to Rosemary.
Many thanks, Richard, indeed, and thank you to everyone who's joined us this morning. Just to remind you that the session has been recorded and will be uploaded to the CABE's YouTube channel soon. Slides and a link to that will be sent out to all who registered. If there's anyone who today's session thinks it would benefit a colleague, please do share the link with them so they can catch up at their leisure. Similarly, if anyone has any topics that they would like to see in our webinars, please get in contact. Or if you yourself feel that you could present one of our webinars, we would love to hear from you. Webinars@cbuild.com. Many thanks again, and hopefully see you online sometime soon. Thank you.